The room exists before it is described, because rooms like it have existed everywhere war has pressed men together under authority. Its dimensions are unremarkable, but its atmosphere is not. It is shaped by anticipation, by the learned reflex of tension that settles into bodies long before a door opens. The men inside do not need instructions to brace themselves. They have done it so many times that the motion is almost involuntary. Shoulders stiffen. Breathing grows shallow. Eyes lower or fix on meaningless details in the walls. In war, the body learns faster than the mind, and this room is a place where the body has learned pain. These men have learned what authority usually sounds like. It is loud, sharp, impatient. It arrives without explanation and leaves without justification. They have learned to expect orders that are not meant to be understood, only obeyed. They have learned that silence can be more dangerous than shouting, because it often precedes the blow. Experience has trained them to read patterns: the cadence of footsteps in a corridor, the scrape of a chair, the clearing of a throat. Every sound is a warning. Every pause carries meaning. In this war, violence has become a language, and they are fluent in it. The title suggests expectation before anything else, and expectation is where this moment begins. Expecting shouts and blows is not a metaphor. It is a reasonable forecast based on everything that has come before. War has conditioned these men to assume the worst because the worst has been consistent. There has been no reason to believe this moment will be different. History, as they have lived it, does not reward optimism. It punishes it. And so they prepare not with hope, but with endurance. If pain is coming, the only control left is how one receives it. The room itself does not offer comfort. It is functional, utilitarian, stripped of softness. War does not waste resources on atmosphere. The walls are close enough to remind the occupants they are contained, but not so close as to feel intimate. This is not a place of conversation. It is a place of transaction, where power moves in one direction and consequences move in the other. The air carries the faint residue of past encounters, moments that have ended badly enough to linger in memory even when the people involved are gone. Outside the room, the war continues in ways both distant and immediate. Somewhere, machinery grinds. Somewhere else, men shout, vehicles move, orders are given. The scale of the conflict dwarfs this room entirely, yet the men inside know that their lives can be altered here just as decisively as on any battlefield. War does not require spectacle to be lethal. Sometimes it operates in small spaces, quietly, with paperwork, with tone of voice, with decisions made by people who will never feel their consequences physically. What makes this moment significant is not yet visible. At this stage, it feels indistinguishable from countless others. The anticipation is heavy, but familiar. Familiarity, in this context, is its own form of cruelty. It means the men do not even ask what might happen. They already know the range of possibilities, and none of them are good. Expectation narrows the future until only pain seems plausible. The men are not naive. They understand hierarchy. They understand that war simplifies moral relationships into commands and compliance. They know that those with authority rarely feel the need to explain themselves to those without it. Apologies do not belong to this world. They are artifacts of peacetime, of civilian life, of systems where mistakes can be acknowledged without collapsing the structure of power. In war, to apologize is often seen as weakness, and weakness is treated as liability. This is why the expectation of violence is so complete. It is not just fear of physical harm, it is fear of the known order asserting itself again. Violence would confirm everything they believe about their position in this conflict. It would reinforce the idea that they exist only as objects to be moved, punished, or discarded. In this sense, brutality is not merely endured, it is anticipated as proof that the world still makes sense, however cruel that sense may be. There is also a deeper layer of fear, one that rarely finds language. It is the fear of being invisible as a moral subject. To be shouted at, struck, or threatened is terrible, but it at least acknowledges one's presence. Indifference is worse. Bureaucratic cruelty, delivered without emotion, without recognition, erases a person more completely than anger ever could. The men in the room do not know which version of authority they are about to face, but both carry the same outcome, their own powerlessness. The title frames this moment as a threshold, though the men do not know it yet. Expectation creates a boundary between what has always happened and what might happen next. At this stage, that boundary feels theoretical. Nothing in their experience suggests it will be crossed. War does not often surprise people in merciful ways. It surprises them with scale, with speed, with devastation. It does not usually surprise them with restraint. There is also the collective nature of the anticipation. Fear shared in silence becomes something heavier than fear alone. Each man is aware not only of his own dread, but of the dread mirrored in the others. No one speaks because speech would break the fragile discipline that has kept them alive. Words could betray weakness. Words could invite attention. Silence is safer, even when it is suffocating. This collective silence reinforces the expectation of violence. It is the posture of people who have learned that nothing they say will improve their situation. Agency has been eroded over time, replaced by strategies of minimization, how to draw less attention, how to endure longer, how to recover faster. The room becomes a holding space for these calculations, each man running them privately while appearing outwardly still. The title's power lies in its contrast, but that contrast only works because the expectation is so absolute. Without this deeply ingrained anticipation of cruelty, what follows would not carry the same weight. The expectation is not an exaggeration. It is the logical conclusion of living under a system where violence has been normalized. This normalization is one of war's most corrosive effects. It teaches people to accept the unacceptable as routine. At this point in the narrative, nothing has been subverted yet. The chapter exists entirely within the logic of fear. It establishes the moral landscape of the war as the men understand it. Authority above, vulnerability below, and no bridge between them. It is a world where dignity has been suspended indefinitely, where survival depends on compliance rather than justice. The room, the men, and their expectation together form a kind of stillness before impact. It is the pause before something familiar, something painful, something that will be endured and then absorbed into memory like so many moments before it. They do not expect fairness. They do not expect explanation. They certainly do not expect apology. That concept does not belong here, not yet. And so Chapter 1 ends not with action, but with readiness. Readiness for harm, readiness for humiliation, readiness for confirmation that this war, like so many others, recognizes power but not conscience. The men wait, braced against a future they believe they already know, unaware that the certainty they rely on is about to fracture, not through violence, but through something far more destabilizing, the refusal of authority to behave as expected. The moment begins not with violence, but with its absence, and that absence is what unsettles the room first. The men are prepared for noise, for impact, for the familiar escalation that confirms their fears. Instead, there is a pause that stretches longer than expected. Authority enters without the theatrical cues they have learned to fear. No shouting announces it. No sudden movement signals punishment. The door opens and nothing happens the way it is supposed to. What follows feels almost procedural at first, which only deepens the unease. The presence in the room is unmistakably official, but restrained. There is no immediate assertion of dominance. No barked command to stand straighter, no demand for attention. The men struggle to interpret what they are seeing because it does not fit into any category they recognize. In war, ambiguity is dangerous. It means the rules are unclear, and unclear rules have consequences. Then the words arrive, measured and deliberate. An apology. Not hedged, not disguised as explanation, not wrapped in sarcasm or threat. A direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The sound of it lands awkwardly in the air, like an object placed on the wrong surface. The men do not react because they do not know how. Their bodies, trained to respond to violence, freeze in the face of something for which they have no reflex. The apology does not sound emotional. That is part of its power. It is formal, restrained, almost administrative in tone. It does not ask for forgiveness. It does not seek absolution. It simply states that something should not have happened, and that responsibility is being acknowledged. In a war defined by deflection and denial, this is profoundly disorienting. The men have heard excuses before. They have heard justifications, rationalizations, even mock sympathy. They have not heard this. The silence that follows is immediate and complete. It is not the silence of fear tightening its grip, but the silence of disbelief. The room does not know how to absorb what has just occurred. Each man waits for the sentence to finish, for the condition that must surely follow. Apologies in war, if they exist at all, are usually transactional. They are preludes to demands, to compromises extracted under pressure. But nothing comes. This silence is heavier than shouting would have been. It forces attention inward. Each man must confront the gap between expectation and reality. The gap is wide enough to be frightening. Violence, for all its cruelty, is predictable. It follows patterns. An apology breaks those patterns. It introduces uncertainty of a different kind. If authority can apologize, then what else might it do? What does it want in return? What rules are being rewritten? The apology also exposes something uncomfortable: recognition. To apologize is to acknowledge that the recipient matters enough to be wronged. It implies a moral relationship, however limited. For men accustomed to being treated as expendable, this recognition feels almost invasive. It demands an emotional processing they have long avoided because survival required emotional suppression. The apology presses against defenses built over months or years. No one speaks. No one moves. The silence is not coordinated, but instinctive. Any reaction feels premature, even dangerous. To respond might invite scrutiny. To remain still feels safer, but also inadequate. The apology hangs in the air, unresolved. It has created a moral imbalance that the room does not know how to correct. Violence would have resolved it instantly, restoring the familiar order. This does not. The men begin to notice details they would otherwise ignore. The tone of voice. The choice of words. The absence of menace. These details matter because they contradict everything they have learned about how power behaves in war. Authority is supposed to be infallible, or at least perform infallibility. Admitting error undermines that performance. Yet here it is, delivered without hesitation. The apology also reframes the past moment it refers to. What was previously experienced as inevitable now becomes contingent. Something could have been otherwise. That realization is subtle but destabilizing. It suggests that suffering was not merely a byproduct of war, but a decision that could be acknowledged and, at least symbolically, corrected. This does not erase the harm, but it changes its meaning. For some of the men, this is harder to bear than cruelty. Cruelty allows resentment to remain focused outward. An apology complicates that focus. It introduces nuance into a moral landscape they have simplified in order to endure it. If authority can admit fault, then the world is not divided as cleanly as they believed. That realization threatens the mental structures that have kept them functional. The silence becomes a shared experience, but not a shared understanding. Each man processes the moment differently. Some feel suspicion tightening in their chest. Others feel an unexpected release of tension, quickly suppressed. No one trusts the feeling enough to acknowledge it. Trust has been trained out of them by repetition. War teaches that hope is dangerous because it creates vulnerability. The apology also does something else, something quieter but no less significant. It slows time. Moments that usually rush past in adrenaline and fear now stretch long enough to be examined. The men are aware of their own breathing, of the weight of their bodies on the floor or chairs, of the presence of others. This heightened awareness is not calming. It is raw. It strips away the emotional numbness that violence often provides as a defense. In this slowed time, the men confront an uncomfortable truth. They want to believe the apology. The desire itself feels risky. Wanting to believe suggests openness, and openness has been punished before. The safest response would be to dismiss the apology as meaningless, as a tactic. But even dismissal requires interpretation, and interpretation requires engagement. The apology has already forced engagement simply by existing. The room remains silent because silence is the only response that does not commit them to an interpretation. It buys time. It allows the moment to exist without being resolved. In war, unresolved moments are rare. Decisions are usually immediate and irreversible. This one lingers, suspended between sincerity and strategy, between moral gesture and political calculation. The authority figure does not press the moment. That restraint deepens the effect. There is no demand for acknowledgement, no attempt to manage the reaction. The apology is offered and then left alone. This restraint communicates something that words alone could not, that the apology is not a performance. It is not contingent on being accepted. It stands on its own. The men sense this, even if they cannot articulate it. The silence shifts again, becoming less defensive and more contemplative. It is still tense, but the tension has changed character. It is no longer the tension of imminent harm, but of moral uncertainty. They are no longer bracing their bodies, they are bracing their understanding. In this moment, the room becomes a rare space where war's usual certainties falter. The apology does not end the conflict. It does not promise safety or justice. But it introduces a crack in the narrative of inevitable brutality. Through that crack, something unfamiliar enters. The idea that power might recognize its own limits. The silence that follows is not empty. It is crowded with thoughts the men have avoided until now. Questions surface without being spoken. What does this change, if anything? Does acknowledgement matter if conditions remain the same? Is dignity meaningful without freedom? These questions do not demand immediate answers, but their presence alone marks a shift. This chapter ends not with resolution, but with suspension. The apology has been delivered. The room has gone silent. Nothing else happens, and yet everything has changed. The men remain where they are, but the moral ground beneath them has subtly shifted. In a war built on noise, movement, and force, this quiet moment becomes its own kind of rupture, one that cannot be easily repaired or ignored. The silence does not dissolve on its own. It settles, thickening into something that feels almost physical, pressing against the men from all sides. In this pause, the apology continues to work its way through the room, not as sound but as implication. It cannot be unheard, and it cannot be neatly contained. The men are no longer simply waiting, they are processing, whether they want to or not. War has taught them to endure events, not to interpret them, but this moment resists endurance alone. It demands meaning. What makes the apology so destabilizing is not its content, but what it exposes. By acknowledging wrongdoing, authority has named a moral boundary that the men assumed no longer existed. Until now, everything they had experienced suggested that power operated beyond accountability, that actions taken under the banner of war were immune to judgment. The apology quietly contradicts that assumption. It implies that some line was crossed, that something should have been done differently. In doing so, it forces the men to reconsider not only this incident, but the framework through which they understand their own suffering. This reconsideration is uncomfortable. It pulls at memories they have carefully flattened into facts to avoid feeling them fully. Pain, when framed as inevitable, is easier to bear than pain framed as unnecessary. The apology tilts the past toward the latter. It suggests that what happened was not simply the cost of war, but a failure within it. That suggestion reopens wounds the men believed had already scarred over. For some, the immediate reaction is anger, sharp and instinctive. Not the hot anger that accompanies violence, but a colder one, edged with resentment. An apology now feels too late, too clean, too controlled. It does not give back what was taken. It does not undo fear or humiliation. It risks becoming an insult of a different kind, a reminder that justice is possible in theory but absent in practice. This anger has nowhere to go. There is no obvious target. It circulates inward, adding to the weight of the silence. Others experience something closer to confusion than anger. Their understanding of authority has been built on consistency, even if that consistency was brutal. This inconsistency unsettles them. If power can apologize here, why not elsewhere? Why not before? These questions threaten to spiral, because each one exposes the arbitrariness of suffering. To survive war, many men accept that suffering is random and impersonal. The apology implies that it was specific and therefore preventable. The room becomes a space of internal divergence. Externally, nothing changes. Bodies remain still. Faces remain guarded. But internally, the men are no longer aligned in their responses. Each is engaged in a private reckoning, shaped by personal history, by how much they have lost, by how deeply they have been wronged. The apology does not unify them. It individualizes them, reminding each man of his own relationship to what has been acknowledged. The apology also alters the meaning of authority itself. Power that admits fault is no longer abstract. It becomes human, and humanity complicates hatred. Hatred thrives on distance and caricature. Recognition disrupts both. The men do not suddenly feel sympathy, but the moral clarity they relied on begins to blur. Authority is no longer a faceless force. It is a source capable of reflection. That capacity forces the men to confront their own expectations about who deserves moral consideration. This confrontation is not welcomed. Moral clarity, even when it paints the world in stark injustices, provides stability. It allows men to locate themselves firmly as victims and others as perpetrators. The apology muddies that clarity without offering resolution. It does not equalize power. It does not grant agency. It simply introduces accountability into a system where accountability has been conspicuously absent. The result is cognitive strain, the kind that exhausts more than fear ever did. The silence stretches because no one knows what a response would signify. To accept the apology feels like surrendering justified resentment. To reject it feels pointless, even performative. To acknowledge it risks implying forgiveness, which feels morally impossible. The men are trapped between interpretations, each one carrying emotional consequences they are unprepared to face. Silence becomes the only position that does not force a choice. In this suspended state, the men become acutely aware of time. Not battlefield time, measured in seconds and reactions, but psychological time, measured in thoughts looping back on themselves. The apology has slowed the forward momentum of the moment, creating space where memory intrudes. Images surface unbidden, previous encounters, moments of fear, faces that did not apologize, voices that did not soften. The contrast sharpens the present moment, making it feel unreal by comparison. The apology also introduces a subtle inversion. For once, authority bears the discomfort. The men can feel it even without looking. Silence does not only belong to the powerless. In this room, it presses upward as well. By apologizing, authority has made itself vulnerable to judgment, even if that judgment is never voiced. The men sense this vulnerability, and it unsettles them almost as much as the apology itself. They are not accustomed to holding that position. This inversion does not empower them in any practical sense, but it alters the emotional geometry of the room. The men are no longer simply absorbing force. They are, however briefly, witnesses. Their silence carries weight because it is not coerced. It is chosen. That choice, small as it is, reintroduces a fragment of agency they believed had been stripped away entirely. Yet agency brings responsibility, and responsibility is heavy. To witness an apology is to be implicated in its moral aftermath. The men are now part of a moment that deviates from the usual narrative of war. That deviation will follow them, whether they want it to or not. It will complicate future memories, future judgments. They will remember not only what was done to them, but what was acknowledged. The apology does not demand forgiveness, but it makes forgetting harder. Violence can be compartmentalized. It fits into expectations. An apology resists that process. It stands out, requiring explanation, demanding to be integrated into a story that previously had no room for it. The men do not yet know how they will integrate it, only that they must. As the silence continues, the men sense that something has irreversibly shifted, not in the external conditions of war, but in their internal understanding of it. The conflict now contains a contradiction: power that can harm and also reflect, authority that can command and also concede error. This contradiction does not redeem the war, but it fractures its moral simplicity. Chapter 3 ends in that fracture. The men remain seated or standing as they were, but the room no longer feels the same. The apology has done its quiet work, dismantling assumptions without replacing them. What remains is uncertainty, heavy and unresolved. The silence holds it all, not as emptiness, but as accumulation, a gathering of thoughts, doubts, and realizations that will not disperse simply because the moment passes. The silence does not break cleanly, it erodes. It thins at the edges as the men begin to feel the weight of having been seen in a way they did not anticipate. What the apology has done, more than anything else, is force an internal reckoning that no external authority can resolve for them. Violence would have ended the moment decisively. This does not. It lingers, pressing each man into an encounter with himself that war has so far allowed him to postpone. For years, survival has depended on emotional containment. Feelings were liabilities, distractions that could get a man noticed, punished, or worse. The safest strategy was to flatten experience into routine, to treat humiliation and fear as whether unpleasant but unavoidable. The apology disrupts that strategy. It reintroduces moral texture into a world that had been reduced to function. With that texture comes discomfort, because moral awareness requires engagement, and engagement carries risk. The men begin to realize that what unsettles them most is not the apology itself, but what it demands of them internally. If authority can acknowledge wrongdoing, then their suffering is no longer purely structural. It becomes relational. Someone, somewhere, is capable of recognizing that harm was done. That recognition implicitly invites the men to recognize themselves not only as survivors, but as wronged individuals. That shift sounds subtle, but it is profound. It pulls them out of anonymity and places them back into the realm of moral consideration. This is where the reckoning deepens. To be morally considered is to be morally addressed, and that brings with it questions they have avoided. What did this moment take from them that they never named? What did they lose when they accepted that mistreatment was simply part of the landscape? The apology does not answer these questions, but it makes them unavoidable. It suggests that what was endured mattered enough to be acknowledged, and that suggestion reopens emotional accounts the men believed were long closed. Some men respond by hardening further. They retreat inward, reinforcing old defenses. If this apology is allowed to matter, it might weaken them. It might soften edges they have spent years sharpening. In war, softness is dangerous. It slows reaction time. It complicates decisions. These men decide, consciously or not, that the apology must be neutralized. They tell themselves it is meaningless, symbolic, irrelevant to reality. This dismissal is not cynicism for its own sake, it is self-protection. Others feel something closer to grief begin to surface. Not grief for a single event, but for an accumulation of moments when no apology came. The apology highlights its own rarity by existing. It throws into relief all the times authority did not acknowledge harm, did not pause, did not reflect. That contrast is painful. It suggests that what they experienced elsewhere was not inevitable, only permitted. Grief, once stirred, is difficult to contain. It does not respect the boundaries that discipline once enforced. The room becomes a quiet site of divergence, not between men and authority, but between the men and their own coping mechanisms. Each man senses that the rules governing emotional survival are being tested. The apology has created a crack in the armor they have worn for so long. Through that crack comes air, but also vulnerability. The men do not know whether to seal it or let it widen. What complicates matters further is the realization that this moment will not repeat itself easily. Apologies in war are anomalies. They are not precedents in any reliable sense. Whatever meaning is extracted from this moment will likely have to last a long time, perhaps the rest of their lives. That knowledge intensifies the pressure to interpret it correctly. The men feel, without articulating it, that they are standing at a junction where memory is being formed. Memory, they know, is not passive. It is shaped by interpretation. How they understand this apology now will influence how they remember not only this moment, but the war itself. If they accept that moral agency existed here, they may be forced to confront its absence elsewhere. If they reject it, they risk flattening a moment that could have preserved a fragment of their humanity. Neither option feels safe. The apology also subtly shifts the moral burden. Authority has acknowledged fault, but that acknowledgement transfers responsibility for meaning onto the recipients. The men did not ask for this burden. They were prepared to endure, not to interpret. Now they must decide, at least internally, what this acknowledgement signifies. War rarely asks the powerless to interpret morality, it usually imposes outcomes. This inversion is destabilizing precisely because it is unfamiliar. The silence continues, but it no longer feels static. It hums with unspoken tension, not of fear, but of moral weight. Each man is aware that something has been placed before him that cannot be ignored. The apology does not command, but it obligates reflection. Reflection, in turn, threatens to reawaken parts of the self that war has demanded be suppressed. In this space, the men become aware of their own humanity in a way that is almost intrusive. Humanity is not comforting here, it is demanding. It requires acknowledgement of pain, of anger, of longing for dignity. These are not emotions that can be easily acted upon in their current circumstances. To feel them without outlet is exhausting. The men sense that the apology has given them something they cannot use, at least not now. This realization breeds frustration. What good is acknowledgement without change? What does dignity mean when conditions remain unchanged? The apology risks becoming a reminder of limits rather than a sign of hope. It confirms that moral language exists, but not that it governs outcomes. This gap between recognition and reality is painful to hold. It exposes the insufficiency of symbolic gestures in the face of systemic power. And yet, even in this frustration, the apology resists being dismissed entirely. It has marked a boundary. It has shown that someone, at least once, recognized that harm required naming. That recognition cannot be undone. It will persist as a point of reference, a moment against which other moments are measured. The men sense that this will matter later, even if it does not help them now. The reckoning deepens as they begin to understand that war has not only harmed their bodies and circumstances, but has trained them to expect moral abandonment. The apology contradicts that training. It suggests that abandonment was not absolute. That suggestion is both comforting and unsettling. Comfort implies loss, and loss demands mourning. The men are not ready to mourn. Mourning requires safety, time, and space, things war does not provide. The room remains unchanged, but internally, the men are no longer where they were. They have crossed into a space where moral questions are active again. That activation is the true reversal of this moment. The apology has not restored justice, but it has restored the possibility of judgment. The men are no longer merely enduring events, they are evaluating them, even if only silently. Chapter 4 ends with this unresolved reckoning. The men sit with a burden they did not anticipate, carrying a moment that has complicated their understanding of power, suffering, and themselves. The apology has not freed them, but it has disrupted the emotional economy of war that demanded numbness above all else. In that disruption lies both danger and the faintest trace of reclamation, a reminder that even here, even now, they are still moral beings, capable of recognizing what should not have happened, even when nothing can be undone. The moment does not remain confined to the room, even though nothing physically leaves it. What has happened begins to radiate outward in the minds of the men, intersecting with everything they know about the war beyond these walls. The apology becomes a reference point, not because it changes their circumstances, but because it disrupts the moral logic by which those circumstances have been explained. War has taught them to think in terms of necessity and inevitability. This moment introduces contingency. Something could have been handled differently. That realization does not stay small. As the silence settles into a more durable form, the men begin to sense how anomalous this apology truly is. They have lived long enough inside the machinery of war to recognize exceptions. Exceptions stand out precisely because systems work so hard to eliminate them. The apology does not belong to the dominant rhythm of command and compliance. It feels out of place, almost foreign, like a civilian artifact that has wandered into a military space by mistake. Its very existence raises questions about the system that produced it. The men begin to see the apology not only as a personal moment, but as a signal, however faint, of an alternative way power might behave. This does not make power less dangerous, but it complicates its image. Authority is no longer entirely opaque. It has shown, briefly, that it can look back at its own actions and name them as wrong. That capacity does not dismantle the system, but it reveals a seam within it. Seams invite scrutiny. This scrutiny extends beyond the immediate actors. The men think of other rooms, other encounters, other moments where no apology came. They think of how often harm was justified as procedure, as policy, as necessity. The apology suggests that at least some of those justifications were choices, not laws of nature. That suggestion is destabilizing because it reframes suffering as something that could have been limited, mitigated, or avoided. It introduces moral responsibility into a landscape that had been explained as morally neutral. The men also understand the limits of this moment. They are not naive. They know the war will not pause because of an apology. Orders will continue to be given. Punishments will continue to be enforced. Violence will continue to shape outcomes. The apology does not interrupt the machinery. It merely acknowledges that the machinery sometimes crushes what it should not. That acknowledgement is meaningful, but it is not power. This tension between meaning and power becomes the core of their reflection. The apology has moral weight, but no operational authority. It does not free them. It does not alter their status. It does not promise protection. In that sense, it risks becoming a hollow gesture, something that soothes conscience without changing reality. The men wrestle with this possibility, because to accept it would be to reduce the apology to self-serving symbolism. And yet, the apology resists that reduction. Its restraint, its lack of demand, its refusal to dramatize itself, these qualities distinguish it from propaganda or performance. The men sense that whoever delivered it did not intend it as a tool of control. That intention matters, even if outcomes remain unchanged. It suggests that moral awareness still exists somewhere within the structure of war, however marginalized it may be. This realization reframes the war itself in subtle ways. The conflict is no longer experienced as a single, monolithic force. It fractures into layers, orders, policies, individuals, moments of choice. The apology illuminates one such moment of choice, and in doing so, casts shadows on all the others. The men cannot help but wonder how many decisions were made without reflection, without acknowledgement, without pause. The apology becomes a silent indictment of those moments, even though it names none of them. The men also begin to think about memory in broader terms. They know that wars are remembered not only through victories and defeats, but through stories that crystallize moral meaning. This apology feels like one of those stories, small in scale but dense in implication. It will not appear in official histories or commemorations, but it will persist in personal narratives, shaping how this war is understood by those who lived inside it. There is an irony here that the men recognize without humor. The apology may matter more after the war than during it. In the present, it offers no relief. In the future, it may become evidence that something better was imaginable even at the height of conflict. That delayed significance is both comforting and cruel. It suggests that the moral clarity this moment provides is not meant to help them survive now, but to help others interpret the past later. This thought deepens the emotional complexity of the moment. The men are caught between being participants and being witnesses to history. The apology positions them as both. They are the recipients of harm and the carriers of a memory that complicates the war's moral narrative. This dual role is heavy. It asks them to hold onto something fragile in an environment that rewards hardness. As they consider the broader machinery of war, the men also recognize how rare it is for institutions to acknowledge failure in real time. Accountability usually arrives after outcomes are decided, after damage is irreversible. The apology disrupts that pattern by occurring within the conflict itself. That timing matters. It suggests that moral judgment does not require hindsight to be valid. Wrong can be recognized even when the pressures of war are still active. This recognition does not redeem the system, but it humanizes a corner of it. The men are cautious about that humanization. They know how easily it can slide into excuse-making. They resist the temptation to generalize from this moment, to imagine that power is suddenly benevolent. But they also resist the urge to erase the moment entirely. To do so would be to deny their own experience. The apology thus occupies an uneasy space between hope and disillusionment. It does not invite optimism, but it challenges despair. It suggests that moral language still has a place, even if it is not dominant. For men accustomed to thinking of the war as an amoral force, this is a significant shift. It complicates their understanding of responsibility, not only for those in power, but for themselves. They begin to ask, quietly and without expectation of answer, what it means to carry this knowledge forward. Does it obligate them to remember differently? To speak differently, if they ever have the chance? Or is survival still the only responsibility that matters? The apology does not provide guidance. It simply exists, forcing these questions into being. The room remains unchanged, but the war beyond it feels slightly altered in perception. Not softer, not kinder, but more morally legible. The men can no longer fully accept explanations that rely solely on necessity. They have seen that acknowledgement is possible. That knowledge will haunt future encounters, making brutality harder to dismiss as automatic. In this sense, the apology is disruptive long after it is spoken.